of a all powerful universe building showrunner was relatively new. And my argument was that this was this incredible window of opportunity for writers who had been starved for this kind of opportunity to suddenly do this incredible work. And alongside that, that writers weren't necessarily the best equipped to do this kind of work, to manage people, to run a room. I mean, we're talking about, and this was, of course, the point, the double meaning of the title. We're talking about anti-heroes in their own right to some extent.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Serialized. I'm your host, Kino, and I'm so excited for today because I'm joined by someone who I'm a big fan of his work. I'm joined today by Brett Martin, a GQ correspondent, three-time James Beard Award winner, and of course, the author of one of my favorite books on television history, Difficult Men, which I have right here, Behind the Scenes of the Creative Revolution. Thank you so much for joining me today, Brett.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'd love for you to just kind of intro yourself a little bit to the audience, tell people kind of your background, how you got started in this world of journalism and where they can find you.
Okay. Well, I have been writing long-form nonfiction in various forms for, I guess, almost 30 years now, largely for magazines, largely at GQ. I write for the Times Magazine, New York Times Magazine, for a whole lot of places. About half of what I do is food writing, which is probably not relevant for you guys. But sometime in the mid-2000s, I was hired to write a book, the official companion book to The Sopranos. And I'd done a fair amount of Hollywood writing, celebrity writing, TV writing by that point. But I was invited on set essentially to do this big lavish coffee table book to accompany the final season of The Sopranos, and wound up through that getting to observe this kind of incredible moment. And out of that grew the book that you're talking about, which is Difficult Men, which was kind of a repurposing of some of the ideas in there. I mean, and a serious amplification of it to kind of catch this phenomenon, which of course now we all take for granted, which was that television was becoming the center of culture.
Absolutely, and I have that coffee table book downstairs on my coffee table actually too. So
Is it literally, it's on your coffee table?
Literally on my coffee table. I don't know if you can see behind me. I have a ton of Sopranos books and books on television history, which I really love. And one of the things I loved about your book, especially Difficult Men, was the emphasis on the people who created the creative revolution, which I love that terminology, because you're right, it is very much a revolution. I think you described in the book the kind of era that starts with The Sopranos is like the third golden age of television, which I definitely agree with. I think that there have been a lot of great eras of television where people were doing some really incredible stuff, but the era that we entered into with The Sopranos and kind of carried on with like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and all these shows was a really interesting time period. And I think that not as much attention is paid to the people who made these shows. There's a lot of attention paid to like the actors and the storylines, and for sure that's a very important part of it. That's the front facing part of it. But the showrunners, and not even just the showrunners, like the individual writers in these writers' rooms are very important. Guys from The Sopranos like Terrence Winter, Matt Weiner, who would go on to have their own shows that would contribute to this era of television. So I really found this book absolutely fascinating. How did you go about kind of researching this book? Obviously, you had experience for that book. You've interviewed David Chase and a lot of these showrunners I know you've interviewed, but what was the process like for you writing this book?
Well, I mean, just to go back to your premise, yes, to me the idea of the book was that this was this moment in which these writers, this job, which throughout film history and throughout TV history had been the most kind of neglected, spit upon, ignored job in the entire business. The writer is just the guy who comes in and pounds out the scripts, had become this what we now call a showrunner, which that was relatively new at the time. The idea, I mean, of course, the role had existed, but the cultural import of a all powerful universe building showrunner was relatively new, and my argument was that this was this incredible window of opportunity for writers who had been starved for this kind of opportunity to suddenly do this incredible work. And alongside that, that writers weren't necessarily the best equipped to do this kind of work, to manage people, to run a room. I mean, we're talking about uh, you know and this was of course the point, the double meaning of the title. We're talking about anti-heroes in their own right to some extent, and what happens when you throw a writer into that level, an artist into that level of power. That was the question that the book set out to ask. And so I was really balancing what was a kind of cultural history, a kind of behind the scenes narrative, group portrait of the Davids, David Chase, David Simon, David Milch, and the joke was, and Larry David, and Matt Weiner, and sort of the second generation that took up after those guys, kind of group portrait of them with a kind of sneaky way of a critical analysis of what was happening in the culture that allowed these things to happen. Um, so it's hard to remember. It's been quite a while, but somehow I sort of began. I think I just started nibbling around the edges until, I mean, the other thing is there weren't all that many people. There were obviously people writing about television, but it was still a story that, film was dominant. It was still not. It wasn't like a tremendous number of people were paying that close attention when I began, and I kind of talked my way into as many rooms as I possibly could get to, and tried to sit down with as many people who were involved in this as I could. It took about, I think it probably took 2 years of reporting and another 2 years to write, is my guess. It's so hard for me to remember exactly right now.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and I definitely agree with you. I think that the showrunner, they're sort of similar to Hitchcock, right? Where directors at one point, no one cared about the directors of movie, and then you get a star like Hitchcock who presents this auteur image, and then suddenly people are like, okay, I'm really paying attention to who the director is on this movie, and they become celebrities in their own right. I think there were showrunners that had achieved a little bit of, fame. You got guys like Rod Sterling on the Twilight Zone or Gene Roddenberry for Star Trek. But is it, in your opinion, is it really like David Chase who becomes the first of these well-known showrunners of the modern age where, we're really paying attention to who makes these critically acclaimed dramas?
Yeah, well, he's the breakthrough. I mean, there is this, you mentioned that I call it the third golden age. What is often forgotten is what is this sort of, and the golden age being the very beginning of television, this kind of when all opportunities were open, and they were doing theater and amazing comedy, and that sort of, everybody knows of that as the golden age. And then what I identified as the second golden age, which is not necessarily always acknowledged, was this pre-period, which actually David Chase came up through with where Stephen Bochco is making, where there are these writers, Stephen Bochco, Stephen J. Cannell, David Milch to some extent with NYPD Blue, are doing, are stretching, getting as close to what would happen on HBO and then cable as you could get within the network confines. And they were sort of stretching that out, and creating in some ways the template for what would become the role that David Chase and others took on. And, but as far as, the kind of cataclysmic event that opens up the floodgates, at HBO and beyond, that, yes, David Chase is kind of where you begin that story.
You touched on this before, the title "Difficult Men," which I really love that metaphor of comparing the difficult men, the anti-heroes of these shows, to their creators, and you see parallels here that a lot of these the people who are behind these shows, your David Chases, your David Milches, they had some conflicts in these rooms. It wasn't always very peaceful. I have a whole video where I kind of went through each of the writers on The Sopranos, because that's the main show that I cover, and a lot of them have some horror stories about, like, yeah, David is a genius, and I'm sure is a very lovely person a lot of the time, but he could be extremely toxic and extremely mean in that room, and that kind of very tough environment has carried through to a lot of writers' rooms. I think a lot of that, we have to be so thorough and so strict, and that can lead to some conflict is something that you see repeated in stuff again, like David Milch's room, in Matt Weiner's room, and that becomes kind of sort of like a thesis of your book a little bit, is that like, yeah, a lot of these environments are not that great.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult, intense setting if you think about what a writer's room is, which is what happens is, so for a film, for instance, physically one person could, and this has now changed, streaming has changed all this, but if we go back to the idea that you were churning out, even though it was many fewer episodes than network had been, you still had to produce 13 episodes. And suddenly you had a writer given all this power to create in mostly his but or his or her vision. But the catch is, in order to do it, you had to work with other people. You had to work with other writers, and so every one of those other writers has their own, is a giant ego and a giant neurotic lunatic in their own right, and has their own ambitions, and has been asked to sit in this room and completely sublimate their desires, actually literally channel the voice of the showrunner. That's the job. The job is to be seamless, and that inevitably, plus just the power involved from the showrunner's point of view, creates these incredibly psychologically intense rooms. And it's not, at a time when we weren't as good about talking about the kind of abuses that take place in every workplace. So it's not surprising that these were places where some pretty gnarly stories come out of.
One of my favorite anecdotes, and you cover this in the book, was Todd Kessler, who wrote on The Sopranos, wrote the season 2 finale Funhouse, co-wrote it with David Chase, is immediately fired afterwards. I think he's given one more chance to write an episode in season 3, doesn't work out. Goes on to create his own show, Damages, on FX, and the show is about a kind of a cruel and mean lawyer boss lady, and there's a lot of people read parallels between that character and how she treats her young protege to how David Chase treated Todd Kessler. But again, I love anecdotes like that. They're so fun to understand the history again between. These are real people writing these shows. A lot of people focus just on the storylines and the characters, and that's great. But there's real world stuff that affects how these episodes are written and how these shows are created. And it's fun to trace that history and that DNA that runs, because a lot of these shows are connected. Again, Matt Weiner, Terrence Winter were both on Sopranos, went on to create their own shows, and there's a lot of examples like that. So I love that history aspect of the book.
Yeah, I think, just to give you one other one, the degree to which these shows wound up being about the making of the shows to some extent, at least a little bit, the what it means to be the boss is, the obsession of the Sopranos. What it means to work for a flawed creative genius and worry you're never going to get credit is something you see in, literally played out in Mad Men, that Matt Weiner experienced in the Sopranos room. So, this is the way writers are. And it is a fun game of figuring out sort of those correspondences.
Now, the one writer's room that I think you title the chapter about Breaking Bad and Vince Gilligan's room is the one nice room or something like that. And it is interesting that his room in specific has been seen as a very positive environment. He in particular has been seen as a very easy person to work with, despite producing 2 of arguably the best shows ever made on television, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And I know you've interviewed Vince and spoken with him. What is it about him and in those rooms in particular that led to this kind of very non-toxic environment when most of every other show seems to have a lot of problems with it?
Well, I think that it gives lie to the idea that a genius has to be an asshole. This was, just to say, this is, I was talking about what the times were, there was and remains a myth of genius as involving toxicity. And it's never been really true. It's usually counterproductive, despite the evidence of certain shows and certain works of art, obviously. But it was striking, particularly then, to go to sit in so I was in the, it must have been Breaking Bad. Forgive me, it's been so long. I sat in the writer's room of Breaking Bad for while I was writing this, and I actually tell the story, to describe. It's one of the places that I actually, a lot of the book I reconstructed through many, many interviews. Um, and as I say, I'd been on a bunch of different sets, but this was one of the rooms where I sat. And it was very striking that, oh no, it doesn't have to be this way at all. And I don't know that I have an explanation for it other than Vince is a mensch. He's notorious. I'm not the first to say that. He's an incredibly, seemingly likable guy, incredibly kind to me throughout, supportive, and it was a nice thing to see after, however long, when I started writing the book, Breaking Bad had just started, and it was not in fact involved. My first four shows when I sold the book were going to be, so The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, and I pitched it as Rescue Me. Do you remember Rescue Me? Which I think has been forgotten, perhaps unfairly, but was another sort of was the step into. And don't forget, the Shield was in there, but FX was a big part of the story, and as time went on, my editor didn't like that. He wanted me to put in Battlestar Galactica, but by the time the book was ending, Breaking Bad had asserted itself as the next big show, so it became very clear. So anyway, the point is that yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think it's held up. And no bad stories that I know of have come out of those rooms. He's just somebody who was able to take on that role without needing to run other people down. It wasn't part of his makeup to need what some of these other guys might have needed.
It's interesting. And I know we talked a little bit that you haven't necessarily kept up with a lot of the newer shows and the stories from them, and I haven't necessarily either. I'm wondering how much things have changed. There continues to be what we call prestige TV. Shows like Succession with Jesse Armstrong and House of the Dragon, and they're still producing more stuff, and there are names that are popping up. It doesn't. I don't know how much they capture the same kind of genius auteur persona that guys like David Chase has. Maybe that will become more clear in time as we get more distance from some of these shows. But I'm wondering how much the landscape has changed, because there is more of a focus now on like not having a toxic work environment, not harassing people sexually or non-sexually, and there's more of an importance on that. So I'm wondering, I wonder how the landscape looks now in terms of writers' rooms. And I know there's a lot more problems than just, having a mean boss. There's, AI problems, there's streaming, residual, there's so much changing about how television is produced as compared to 10, 20 years ago. So I'm sure it's completely different, but I'm wondering how much that persona has kind of carried on since then.
Yeah, well, I think there's been a lot of skepticism directed towards that kind of character, and across culture. I don't know where we are now, frankly, in the culture. I wouldn't be surprised if it's back. But the other thing, but you allude to much bigger changes in the structure of how these things get made. First of all, streaming took away part of what I was talking about, which was this need for a room, to keep stuff churning. You got a lot more single writer stuff. And again, I just want to go back to, the all powerful auteur is only one piece of the puzzle that I'm writing about. The other is how that person is forced to collaborate, which I think is a crucial point. And I don't know that that happens anymore. And then the economics. I am not an expert on it. I haven't. But certainly the strike last year, 2 years ago, last year, time compresses, revealed how eroded so much of what this golden age was built on. How much of that had eroded, which part of which was having a writing staff, which they have to fight for now. But that was one of the huge sticking points. So I don't know, but I would hope that I do think you have a generation of writers of workers who have learned that they have rights and are not won't tolerate certain kinds of behavior.
Again, I'm not someone who's ever been in a writer's position. I don't know how these rooms work. I think that having a consistent voice is important for some. Having a leader and a voice is important for maintaining a show's consistency. And I think we still see that with a lot of prestige shows that come out and have that kind of consistent quality throughout. But it doesn't necessarily need to be toxic, as we saw with Vince Gilligan's room and other rooms since then. Yeah, I think that the way that streaming, and I know that's what the strike was about primarily, is people talk about a lot of the declining quality of television as compared to like 20 years ago. We don't see the same types of shows being produced. I think some of that is a little bit, hindsight bias, where we only remember the good shows that came out. We don't remember all the duds that came out alongside them. And there were a lot of those too. But I think one of the problems is, again, the shrinking of the writers' room and giving the writers and creative people less resources as time has gone on. And that's led to, I think you need strong writers' rooms, because, again, even when we have the genius auteur creators like David Chase, David Milch, and David Simon, all these guys, a lot of stuff came from their individual writers. Again, you can follow that in the book, you can follow that in interviews, where it's like, oh yeah, this incredible episode, this incredible idea came from one of the writers. It came from Terrence Winter, it came from Matt Weiner, whoever, and they brought that, and David Chase wouldn't have necessarily come up with that on his own. So I think the writers' room are absolutely critical, even when their name is not on the marquee, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, that's my argument, is that there was this unique creative space. One of my arguments anyway was that is the essential kind of creative place of this art form, and yeah, for all kinds of reasons, it doesn't exist in that way anymore, or at least it's rarer. The other problem being that and maybe this, you would have guessed this was a fancy problem to have, but that it's incredibly difficult to get seen now. Like that we're bombarded by so much stuff. It's hard to tell where it is, when it is. We're not what and so it just flows by as though there's this huge river of content. And the companies behind it have different kinds of incentives than they once did. The idea of prestige is not something that shareholders in Apple care about particularly, or I'm not to signal that I am not a business reporter, and again haven't followed it, but it seems very clear that short term the idea that buzz is itself worth investing in seems to have diminished, and that was one of the very important building blocks that allowed this thing to happen, despite all the forces that were against it.
For sure. And you talked a little bit before about like FX and AMC, these networks that were kind of chasing HBO for a while, of like trying to make these prestige dramas, get that buzz, get those awards. And in those cases, it seems like they've kind of fallen off to an extent. Obviously, FX and AMC both continue to make shows that are, I'm sure, good. But they're not in the same discussion. Or really, only HBO has continued to be the one where it's like, oh, you want prestige TV, you go to HBO. Apple, to an extent, has been dipping their foot into there. Netflix, for a little while, was trying to compete, but then it seems like they've kind of fallen off too. So again, it seems like you're right. Only really HBO has continued to be like the one place where we're gonna make really prestige TV here. And again, you can have opinions on the quality of the shows that come out since then, but it seems like they're the only ones who are really focused on that, rather than just trying to get like the most views as quickly and cheaply as possible.
I mean, I've seen great work. One of the things that's happened is that it's hard to know. I've seen great work on Hulu. I've seen great work on Prime. I've seen great work on Netflix. None of those places feel like I know what a Netflix show looks like, that I know what a Hulu show looks like in the way that you once knew what an FX show was like a Hulu. I mean, that's part of the vast amount of stuff that's out there. I have to say that I was naive about how this would go to some extent. That one of my other arguments was that this happened because as culture fragmented, you needed, and as there were more and more, once it was no longer 4 channels that you could watch, you needed something to make your channel exist, that either you had an identity or you disappeared. And that was why it was worth investing in, of all things, writers and artists. And you saw that happen once HBO was the big dog. You saw basic cable having to do it, and once that happened, you saw Netflix having to do it. And I just assumed there'd always be somebody for whom that bargain was worth it. That's what they felt that they had to do. And the particulars of the tech business and of the streaming business, and kind of the decline of those the folks who run those places, as far as I can tell, have kind of proven me wrong. I think, unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic as I once was.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that about a lot of things going on. It kind of gets worse, over time and the longer it goes on. I wanted to talk a little bit about Matt Weiner in particular, because right now I'm in the middle of a long form retrospective that I'm working on for Mad Men, where I kind of do a very deep dive into the series. And part of that, I did the same thing for The Wire. And part of that aspect was digging into the writers and the creative people behind those shows and kind of shedding light on them. You did an interview for GQ with Vince Gilligan, Matt Weiner, and David Milch, all star, incredible lineup there. And there was one moment of the interview that I really, really loved that you drew attention to, which is kind of this thing that he was criticized for, which is putting his name basically on every single script he touches. And was that something you kind of wanted to bring up to, again, shed some more light on the other people in the room besides just the showrunner, the guy with the name on the marquee?
Well, yeah, I don't. I mean, I remember the interview, of course. That was quite a room, and I don't remember what his answer was, except probably, "Hey, I wrote it." I mean, I think that was, I think that Matt, probably struggled, this tension that I was talking about earlier about sort of the tantalizingly close ability to completely control and author something with this terrible need to have other people, which probably was, as you point out, in their best interest, but must have felt like a real burden, to deal with. And I think he handled that in his own way. And frankly, Chase, David Chase had done a lot, put his name on a bunch of scripts as well. And their argument was, I did all this work. The other part of that is there was a real financial piece of that. That for writers who were for hire, who weren't going to be necessarily, who were, it meant there was, I don't know what the specifics are, but there was back end money involved, and so there was a real kind of that had to be part of the calculation also, which is something that a lot of caused a lot of resentment. And I'm not sure it was the most forward thinking kind of management style. I've never had to run a group of people in that way, but it was among the things that people left that room resentful or angry about.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about Matt, which really seems to me, and I never met the man. I'm not looking to do a hit piece on him or anything, but it just seems like he wanted to be that center of attention for the show rather than letting some other people shine, in that writing room. I mean, David Chase, for all his faults, did let people like Terrence Winter, Matt Weiner shine to an extent, to the extent that they got their own shows and deals later on. I think Chase even really supported that. But one of the reasons I like that you brought up that putting their name on every script basically thing is, for the Mad Men writers room in particular, it felt like the writers did not get to shine through in the way that some other shows did. It's hard for me to even find information on those particular writers. I know of a few, but one of the things I really liked about these other writers' rooms is the people who were in there got to shine to an extent and got to go do on their own projects. Peter Gould with Vince Gilligan got to eventually co-write and essentially lead Better Call Saul. There's other great examples of that too, and I don't know. I really loved that you called him out on that, because I think that kind of that hogging the attention thing is one of the things I just don't like about his public persona. And again, I never met the man. I'm not trying to do a hit piece, but that just what I see from interviews and stuff. Even this interview, I have it on GQ here, and I was counting how many times Matt Weiner talked in comparison to David Milch and Vince Gilligan, and it's like he's the majority of the
Well,
talking.
let's be clear. David Milch is not a wilting flower either, so it would not be. Yeah, and that is often the function. Just nothing you're saying is wrong, but I also would caution that when you assemble a round table like that, it's not always necessarily reflective of exactly what went down in the room. But I would also say that it's probably wasn't that different. I will say about Matt Weiner that he is admirably candid about where he's coming from and always was, and does not try to hide his neuroses, his insecurities, his fears, his vainness, his vanities, and you know, I find that and maybe it's been long enough that I find that kind of admirable this way.
I don't want to say that any of these writers are bad people. Like, let's be clear, being weird, neurotic, and borderline a little mean at times does not make you a bad person. I don't think David Chase, from anything I've seen, would say he's a bad person overall. Is he mean sometimes? Sure. Is David Milch said some things and been a little weird in his rooms? Absolutely. But I don't think that they're necessarily terrible people for doing this stuff. But I think it is important to call out some of it, which again, I really admire that you did that in the interview. A lot of people would have been like, I'm just gonna ask you questions that kind of lift you up, and it's tempting to do that as an interviewer, but I like that you called out that process
So
there.
what is his answer? Would you mind reading it if you've got it there?
Yeah. He says, I don't know why anyone would want their name on something they didn't write. I don't want to discredit someone for taking the first swing at something because that's huge. Even if I throw out the whole thing, they helped me. But over 80% of it is rewriting. I'm going to put my name on it. And then you countered that, hey, you're the showrunner. The implication is that every single script that comes through here has your fingerprints on it. And he admits he's kind of breaking with tradition. David did it, but not to the same extent that he did it. And then you asked Vince and David Milch if they did it, and they said not typically, both said not typically. And then I think Vince Gilligan afterwards kind of felt a little bad and defended Matt and said like, yeah, Matt's right. But again, it's just an interesting call out from an industry practice perspective. And again, I know this is something that 90% of people don't give a shit about, of like whose name is on the fucking script, but for
Well,
someone
no, but
who's
I just want to remember, what I said before. Is that there was real monetary implications to that, and that's and implications in, as you pointed out, as far as who's going to get the call, who's going to get the meeting, whose name is known in the business, and so there's real stuff in there, and I guess I'm glad I asked him too.
Yeah, no, I think it's weird. Like we talked about the David Kessler or the Todd Kessler story, co-wrote an episode that won an Emmy, the season 2 finale. Immediately fired the next day for not being a good writer, which is a little weird. And you wonder, like, is it an ego thing? Is it the fact that I don't like having to share the Emmy with this guy who co-wrote the episode? I don't know. Again, I wasn't there. I can't say for any of these things, but it's interesting to look from a critical perspective of like, yeah, there's real, emotions and stuff that goes into this, and it's not all happy, good, fun writing time.
Oh, for sure, it's not happy, good fun writing. Writing is terrible under the best of circumstances. So, yeah, no, I think they were very stressful, intense places to work, and I think oftentimes rewarding. I hope so, and I mean, I got that feeling, but yeah, no, unquestionably intense.
Well, I know we kind of covered everything I really want to talk about for the book here. I'd love to give you an opportunity to kind of shout out, the work you're doing. I know you're continuing to contribute to GQ, writing a lot of food reviews and stuff like that. Can you tell people like where they can find you and your upcoming work?
Sure. Yeah, you keep your eye on GQ. As I say, I've been doing some work for the Times. I am on Blue Sky at Brett Martin, BrettMartin. That's probably the sort of my social media channel of choice. Usually that's about it. I've got yeah, you can anything I do, you'll be able to find it there.
I'll include your links to all this stuff in the description of this video. Guys, definitely, if you are interested in the kind of behind the scenes look at a lot of the shows that I cover on this channel, please go read Difficult Men. It is one of the best books I have ever read on this topic. So thank you again so much for joining me today, Brett. It was fascinating to talk with you. And I loved learning more about the behind the scenes stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you reading, and I appreciate you wanting to talk.
Absolutely. And stay tuned for the next episode of Serialized, coming soon.